My name is Jeff Barnes, and I am the author of Forts of the Northern Plains, a guide to the historic forts of the Plains Indian Wars. I'm a native of Omaha, born and raised in Nebraska, and lived in Omaha till I was about 9, and family moved to a farm south of Utah, and they still live and farm there, and went to school at University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and back in Omaha now, which is where I make my home with my family. I went to school at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, journalism graduate, back when they called it the J School. It's the J College now, I guess, but started out in broadcasting, although my interest was always in writing. So almost immediately after graduation, I had a job with a radio station here in Lincoln, but took off for a while, went hitchhiking around the Northern Plains, and came back and got a newspaper job at the Nebraska City News Press, and that's started out in newspapers for most of my early career. Business editor of a business newspaper in Omaha, and from there went into politics a little bit. I was Ben Nelson's first press secretary when he ran for governor, and from there went to work for a number of advertising agencies in Omaha. An architectural firm as their PR manager, and most recently director of marketing for the Durham Western Heritage Museum. And for the last about the last 2 years, I've been a freelance writer, living and working in Omaha. Nebraska and the Plains very definitely have influenced my writing. I'm actually a fifth generation Nebraskan. My family has been here since the early 1880s, homesteader up in Holt County, and this is where my ancestors have been. This is where I raised my kids. This is what I consider home. This is where I want to be. I've always been a nut about history, and having been a reporter also, that's probably why I got into reporting. But just a curiosity about things, why things are the way they are, and that's what led to the book. I knew about these places. I had seen passing references to them in histories of the Great Plains Indian Wars, and it was just kind of a curiosity. Well, why was that fort built there, and what else happened there? Why was it decommissioned? What does it look like now? And that's the kind of thing that was driving me to get started on the book and finish it. Right now, it's the military history because that's always kind of been a love of mine. But as I drive around the Great Plains, and for this book I put in about 13,000 miles to visit all of these sites. So you gain, I think, a greater appreciation and love for what the Great Plains does entail. I mean, you see things that don't look like they belong on the plains, and you kind of develop your curiosity about them as well and want to find out more about them. So I don't think my writing will stick with the military history. I imagine I'm going to be seeing a lot more of the plains in other areas. Okay. I've really become kind of an erratic writer. I'll wake up at 3:30 and start thinking about something and say, I probably should go write this down now while I'm thinking of it. I'm not really the kind of guy that will set aside blocks of time and just say, I'm going to focus on this and get it done. It's kind of when the mood strikes, that's when I get into it, and then I don't care how long it takes. It's just keep writing until I'm satisfied that that's what I need to do then. Okay. I think it's probably a holdover from my reporting days. I know as a newspaper reporter, working at a general assignment reporter for a daily newspaper, the articles that I produced, I wanted to make them understandable by anybody that would pick up the paper and read it. And I think that carries over to the writing as well. I don't want to call it simple, but understandable. And I want it easily understood by anyone that has an interest in the field. And I know in the editing, I'll go back and change words that I thought, I think there's a good chance there's a lot of people that won't know what that word is. And I'll either find a better one or take some time to explain what it is. But it's trying to reach the broadest audience possible, I think, rather than write to a specific core group of people. I think I write for people like me, because this is the kind of book that I would pick up on a shelf and just leaf through it, and I say, I don't have to read it. I just can tell from the subject that I'm going to need this, or something like that, because I can't tell you how many books similar to this that I have picked up. And that's what I kind of want to write for the general person who has an interest in history, this particular area of history, and say this would be a good reference book for me, or this would be a good guide for me if I want to go see these places myself. So it's kind of those guys that stop in at the national park sites and immediately head for the bookshop and see what's new on the shelves that they didn't know about before. I think, well, in terms of this book, I think a greater appreciation for the forts, what they were all about. One thing I say in my talk is that you can't say a fort is a fort is a fort is a fort. These are all different. I found 51 different sites for this book, and one thing that struck me almost immediately is that I'm not finding a lot of parallels in here. Forts were built for different reasons, for different people, for different purposes. They had different lifespans. Some were around for a month. Some have been going for more than 125 years. They were built of different materials. Forts were generally built with what materials were on hand. So you have adobe, timber, concrete in some instances, sod, brick, and it really kind of surprised me when I got started on this, just the sheer variety that the forts did come in. Mm-hmm. If you do want to write, then you better start writing, because you're not a writer unless you're writing. And there's times where I say, I haven't written for 3 or 4 weeks here. I need to do that again so I can keep my status as a writer. But if you have a strong feeling about something, absolutely start getting it down. Because I can't tell you how many times I've thought about things and I didn't know if they were passing notions, but it turns out they weren't. I kind of wish I'd at least put them down on paper and to flesh it out, because what I started here, what I ended up with, is completely different from what I started with. And it's only because I started putting it down on paper and made those additions. So definitely start writing. As far as getting published, the best thing to do, for what worked for me anyway, go through your library, see who publishes the kinds of books that you read. I was fairly fortunate. Just in my instance, I started with University of Nebraska Press, Bison Books. Sent them the manuscript first. I got a call from them almost immediately asking about it. The unfortunate thing is, and anybody that's written a book and had editors change, when you lose your editor, you're probably done at that press as well if you're not established with them. And sure enough, she got a different job and said I'd be in good hands, but a month later her replacement said, "I'm sorry, this doesn't meet our editorial needs right now." So it's kind of somebody else's kid at that point, and they don't want to raise your kid. So I just went down the line in my bookshelves and found Stackpole Books, and they published histories of the Old West, and they had some interest in travel guides. So I sent a proposal to my editor, and he responded almost immediately via email saying that he liked the idea and his history sales rep liked the idea, and so went from there. So definitely look in your own library and see who publishes what you read, because that's going to be your best option, I think. Of course, I'm working on the exciting sequel to this book, Forts of the Southern Plains, so people can find out what happened down in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma. I'm also working on a travel guide to the sites of Custer on the Great Plains, his forts and fights and other incidents that he was involved in. Always had an interest in Custer, of course, everybody does, and so if you're writing in this area, you tend to say, I need to do a Custer book someday. Today I'm going to be doing some readings from the book. I'll highlight 4 different forts, and they kind of run the gamut of what forts what's out there now are all about. They range from a very busy, very active state park, probably the most visited site of the 51 forts featured. And it'll go to a smaller town museum located in one of the fort buildings. It will go to a site that doesn't have any buildings remaining, but it's still recognized as a historic site. And the last one will feature a site that was visible when I visited it, but now is gone again. It comes and goes. And if you catch it at the right time, you can walk the grounds probably illegally, but now you can't. So kind of tell people about that one. That should be fun. I'm also going to encourage people to visit the sites. A good number of these locations are state historical parks, and Nebraska is no different than any other state. We've got budget concerns, and that's one thing that's definitely going to impact these publicly owned sites. And so I'm going to, I guess, offer some encouragement for people to visit these sites. The only way to keep them open is through visitation. And I found in the course of doing talks about the forts, there are a good number of sites, state historical parks, that people in our own state don't know about, have never visited, didn't even know that they were there. So it's going to be an encouragement to acquaint themselves with these sites.
My name is Meredith McGowan, and I am the curator of the Heritage Room. I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're excited that this reading series has been around for about 25 years. And actually, this one is the 186th reading, so thank you for being here. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. It's a special collection that's dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. There are about 13,000 volumes here on the side, written by about 3,000 authors. And we also do have information files, pictures on the walls, magazines, manuscripts. We have several birds that were carved, owls that were carved by Paul Johnsgaard that are back behind you in case you want to look as you go out the door later, and other memorabilia too. So we would invite you to come back. Well, actually, we used to have the Ames reading on Thursday evenings when we weren't open, but now I'm inviting you to come back when we're open, and we're actually open right now on Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5. So, but we would invite you to come back when you look around a little bit too. So on Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3 as well. If you're watching this on 5 City TV, I just want you to know that we are located on the 3rd floor of Bennett Martin Library, 14th and N in downtown Lincoln. We'd also like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. We're able to bring you special programs like these because of an endowment established through their volunteer efforts. Our reader today is Jeff Barnes. He's a freelance writer and a 5th-generation Nebraskan who lives in Omaha. He's been a newspaper reporter and an editor, the past chairman of the Nebraska Hall of Fame Commission, and the former marketing director for the Durham Western Heritage Museum. He's researched, photographed, and written his first book, a guide that's entitled Forts of the Northern Plains, and it was published by Stackpole Books. We're happy to have Jeff here with us. If you could please help me welcome him, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Meredith. This is kind of unique for me. This is what we're talking about numbers here. This is actually my 99th appearance related to this book since it came out last summer. I come from a marketing background, so I'm fairly active in getting word out about things, and so it's very unusual for me in that I'm doing a reading today. I don't usually do readings. It's part of it, I hate to wear glasses because it kind of give me a headache after a while. The second thing, though, I just never thought of as a travel guide as being like a read out loud kind of things, but in the spirit of the room, I felt I want to do this today. I do a program for the Nebraska Humanities Council on the forts of Nebraska, and that's what I usually do, and that's kind of an off the cuff sort of talk. I mean, I've given it enough times I can do it in my sleep, but don't have to read it very often, which is nice to do. And it's also going to be kind of unique here in that I can't directly see the screen, but I can see a much smaller one, and that should help out. tell you a little bit about the book if you're not familiar with it. Forts of the Northern Plains is an historical travel guide to 51 different fort sites of the Northern Plains states. I ended up driving about 13,000 miles to visit all 51 of these sites. And I'm very glad I did, because I found out in the course of doing this, and in the course of doing my research leading up to it and checking other guides, there's quite a few people that have written things about the forts without seeing them. And the very first fort that I visited, Fort Ridgely up in Minnesota, of course, told the person, the guide there, what I was working on, and she said, "Well, I'm so glad you came to visit us, because somebody had written a book about the fort, and it became very, very obvious that the person had never been there. He had just done internet research, and people were showing up at the fort site and angry about what they were seeing because it wasn't anything like what was described in the book. And consequently, the gift shop at Fort Ridgely didn't sell the book." And I said, "Well, if I'm going to make a living at writing, I want you to sell my book, so I definitely have to be here and visit the other sites to make sure that I knew what I was talking about." Question a lot of people ask me is why a book about forts? What brought this on? And I'll tell you a little bit about personal interest. I've always been a history nut, and kind of tended toward the military history. Whenever I was on a business trip or a personal trip, if there was a fort or a battlefield within an hour of where I was going, I'd always make special arrangements to go check it out myself. And this was in, I think, 2003. My family and I, we were coming back from Yellowstone on a family vacation. I had never been to Fort Sidney in Sidney, Nebraska, and I said, this is the opportunity to do so. So we got there, and I can't remember what time of day it was, like around noon or something like that. And the place was closed, the museum and the officers' quarters. Well, I thought, well, this is the tourism season. It should be open, but I thought, well, I'll catch it the next time I'm in town. I wasn't sure when that would be, but as it happened to be, I was in Sidney the following year, and I think it was a little bit after 3 o'clock, and I said, great, this is perfect. It's summertime, it's in the afternoon. I'm not going to have any trouble getting in there. Well, I got to Fort Sidney, and it was closed again. That black and orange sign was up in the door. As it turns out, Fort Sidney is open for 2 hours in the morning. They break 2 hours for lunch, and they're open for 2 hours in the afternoon, and they close up at 3 o'clock, which isn't very convenient for a tourist, but for volunteers, that's sometimes what you have to have. And if you get somebody there for 4 hours a day, that's better than no hours a day. But still, on the way back, driving back to Omaha, frustrated about this, I said, I need to put together a list of these sites that I haven't seen with their hours and maybe a phone number. So if I'm running late, I can call ahead and let them know that I am coming. And started thinking, I should do this for friends that have a similar interest, so I can include information with that with places I have been. And it's a long drive back from Sidney to Omaha. And the more things I thought about what I'd put on this list, it started turning into a booklet. And by the time I got home, I thought, if nobody has written a book, a travel guide to these sites, if nobody's written this book, I'm going to write it. And as fortune had it, nobody had written it, at least for about 35 years. And so I thought this is the opportunity. So the first reading I'm going to do today is about the fort that inspired it all, Fort Sidney. If it hadn't been for them and their wacky hours, I wouldn't be here today doing this. One thing could be said about Fort Sidney and the surrounding boomtown of Sidney. Life was not boring. Named for Union Pacific President Sidney Dillon, this western Nebraska town had 89 saloons at its peak, 23 in one block. Gamblers and prostitutes, soiled doves as they were called, were everyday citizens. Scores of hangings were held to mete out justice, and 2 of them were actually legal. Dusk to dawn burials also took place at the fort's Boot Hill Cemetery. No one had to answer questions if the deed was done alone after midnight. Even the soldiers there to keep the peace weren't immune from the Wild West lifestyle. A tale is told of a soldier who was shot dead at a roadhouse dance, and revelers simply moved him to a corner so the dance could go on. 2 more bodies joined his before the night was done. Sydney could hardly help itself for its reputation as the toughest town on the tracks. Throughout the late 1860s and into the 1870s, the town hosted rail crews, gold seekers, freighters, gamblers, trappers, pioneers, gunmen, and probably every type of stereotypical Old West personality you'd ever hope to find. Every day in Sydney, 1 million pounds of goods and 1,500 passengers passed through, and then there were Fort Sydney's 200 soldiers. Such a role certainly wasn't planned for the city and the post. Sydney Barracks was established in 1867 as a subpost to Colorado's Fort Sedgwick to protect Union Pacific workers from Indian attacks. It became an independent post in 1870 and was renamed Fort Sydney in 1878 to reflect its permanent status. The end of the rail line moved on in the 1870s, but the excitement was just getting started. General Custer confirmed reports of gold in the Black Hills in 1874, and Sydney soon became a takeoff point for those seeking the precious metal, a depot for those shipping it, and a home for those who made a living off of both groups. Buffalo Bill Cody was a frequent visitor. He loved it here and carved his initials in a pew at one of the town's churches. Calamity Jane was here, had an affair with a soldier, and gave birth to a child that she later gave up for adoption. She liked men, but not children, say the museum staff. Famed Army surgeon Walter Reed headed his first hospital at Fort Sydney, keeping meticulous notes on all births and treatments. During the gold rush, Fort Sydney became a receiving depot for freight to be shipped to the northern forts and Indian agencies, and its soldiers became escorts for some of the larger bull trains on the trail. Units at the post were sent for duty in 1876 on the Yellowstone and Powder River expeditions, and the fort was also a staging area for Army forces sent to intercept Cheyenne bands breaking from their Oklahoma reservations. The 1880s were relatively peaceful in that part of the Great Plains, and Sydney started to tame as well when the fort and the railroad ran out the outlaws in 1882. Fort Sydney sent troops to the Rosebud Agency in South Dakota in 1891 to allay fears of the Indians' ghost dance movement. They arrived in time to clean up after the Wounded Knee massacre. The need for Fort Sydney was gone soon after that. The post was abandoned in 1894, and the buildings were sold at auction in 1899. Most of the 40 buildings that made up the fort disappeared over the years as a result of age, fire, demolition, and neglect. Fort today, a residential area built up around the surviving buildings, of which today there are 3. The 1884 officers' quarters today serve as the Cheyenne County Museum at 6th and Jackson Street, and that's depicted at the top of the screen there. A few doors south on 6th Street is the 1871 commanding officer's home, and a few doors south on 5th Street is the octagonal 1872 powder magazine. The museum has a small exhibit on the fort, along with a few items from fort days, plus a large and diverse collection of antiques and other items showing the history of the county. Plan on at least an hour for a fair examination of the displays. Once you are through the museum, the attendant will escort you down the street to the commanding officer's home, which includes period furnishings and a diorama of Fort Sydney. The powder magazine may be viewed only from the outside. An annual event called the Sydney Gold Rush Days is held each July with a number of fun history workshops, performances, and food, celebrating the time when Fort Sydney neighbored the toughest town on the tracks. Now, when I started the book, of course, Fort Sydney is a staff site. When I started the book, hang on. I was kind of curious where it was going to end, particularly in defining what made the Great Plains. There are so many descriptions of where the plains ends and where it starts. Some descriptions have it starting in Illinois. Some put it at the Missouri River. I've seen other maps that have it starting roughly between, well, for Nebraskans, between Omaha and Lincoln. As soon as you get out of the hills of the eastern part of the state and the land starts getting flat, people say that's where the plain starts. And it's even worse on the western end. And I found out very quickly that the biggest enemies to me in completing this book were time, space, and money. And I realized that if I'm going to have a map in the book, it's going to have to be square, and I'm going to have to draw the dividing line somewhere. So technically, you see the map here. I've got 3 forts listed in Montana, and the Great Plains actually continues westward in Montana. And there's a few more forts that I could have included in the book, but It would have all involved a couple more days of travel, which I just didn't have, and I did have a deadline on which I had to finish the book, and so that became part of it. So what you see here is it worked out best for me, time-wise, money-wise, and space-wise. I will tell you one thing, that most guides to the Indian Wars don't include Iowa, and a good portion don't include Minnesota. I did include Minnesota. I mentioned I start with Fort Ridgely. And I was kind of sticking with the tried and true, I don't know if it was true, but that's of not including Iowa in the book. And I'm not sure why previous historians haven't included that. And I did submit the manuscript. I sent it off in October it was about 2 years ago. And I sent it off to the publisher and didn't include Iowa. And I was still kind of in the writing mode, and I still wanted to do more on this. And I had this kind of gaping hole in the southeast corner of the map. And I finally said, the problems with the Sioux in Iowa led to the problems with the Sioux in Minnesota, which led to the problems with the Sioux in the Dakotas and the rest of the plain. And I thought, just because no one else covers Iowa doesn't mean I can't cover Iowa. And I called my editor and I said, is it too late? Can I add 5 more fort sites to the book? And he says, no, that's fine. In fact, that opens up another sales territory for the book too. I said, oh, even better. So I think the guide is somewhat unique in that it does cover the Sioux Wars in Iowa in the 1840s and 50s, which were very traumatic for the citizens of the region. And as I said, it did kind of have a domino effect on the Great Plains. One fort that I wasn't going to include that I'm going to read about now is Fort Snelling up in Minnesota. And that was another reason of kind of geography. The fort is located in St. Paul, which technically is not considered part of the Great Plains. It's, I don't know, there's some kind of geological discussion of where it actually is located. But ultimately, I said this was the headquarters of the Department of the Dakota, which covered a good portion of the Plains Indian Wars, and it only should be covered for that reason alone, if not for others. But anyway, here's Fort Snelling. In the early 1800s, the northwest frontier became extremely valuable to the United States for the abundance and richness of its furs. Because the traders and Indians in the upper Mississippi Valley were loyal to the British and Canada, however, most of the commerce was headed north and ultimately to Great Britain. To establish its presence, the U.S. government in 1819 began building a series of forts in the region. Fort Howard near Lake Michigan, Fort Atkinson on the Missouri, above Omaha today, Forts Armstrong and Crawford downstream on the Mississippi, and Fort Snelling at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. Colonel Josiah Snelling led the troops who built the fortress on the rocky crag overlooking the rivers, starting in 1819 and completing the post in 1825. Unlike many other forts, Fort Snelling was constructed of stone, ensuring its permanence for years to come. Fort Snelling soon became a hub for the upper Mississippi region. Like its sister post, it won the hearts of the indigenous tribes through gifts, fair trading, and even a little intimidation when necessary. Its troops enforced treaties and laws, kept the whites out of Indian lands, and apprehended outlaws. Because the rivers were shut off to non-U.S. citizens, the fur traders were making their deals at Fort Snelling rather than to the north in Canada. Settlers appreciated the nearness of a fort for their defense. One settlement that was too close to the fort was told to move downriver. The new settlement, formed in 1839, eventually grew into the city of St. Paul. Much of the Minnesota Territory was open to white settlement in 1851. Forts Ripley, Ridgely, and Abercrombie were the new guardians of the region, and Fort Snelling was relegated to a supply post. In 1858, activity had declined so much that the government sold the fort to a land developer for establishment as a town site. But the Civil War changed those plans when Minnesota sent troops to fight for the Union, and Fort Snelling found new life as a training center for thousands of volunteers. Following the war and a visit by General William Tecumseh Sherman, the fort was identified as a troop and supply post. An exchange of land satisfied the developer who had bought the post, and Fort Snelling became headquarters for the Department of Dakota, heading more than a dozen forts from the Mississippi to the Rockies. Fort Snelling supplied troops for the Plains Indian campaigns of the 1880s and the Spanish-American War in 1898. Between the wars, much of the deteriorating stone portions of the fort were demolished to make room for new barracks, officers' quarters, and storehouses. Leading up to and after World War I, parades, band concerts, athletic contests, and polo matches were regular activities at Fort Snelling. It also had tennis courts, a golf course, swimming pool, and hunting club. Life at the Posh was so plush that Fort Snelling was often called the country club of the Army. That ended in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. During World War II, the fort processed and trained hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It also hosted a unique Japanese language and intelligence school that graduated more than 6,000 Japanese Americans for service in Washington, D.C. and the Pacific. Following the war, the Army no longer needed Fort Snelling, and in 1946 the post grounds were turned over to the Veterans Administration for use as a hospital, already substantially changed from its founding. The fort seemed destined for total destruction in the 1950s with plans for a freeway. But that fate for one of Minnesota's first landmarks was too grim for many members of the public, who succeeded in diverting the freeway project, saving the ruins, and gaining Fort Snelling's designation as the state's first National Historic Landmark in 1960. Public and private efforts continued to rebuild the fort, and the work was completed in 1983. Fort today, historic Fort Snelling is Minnesota's most visited historic attraction, not only for its location between the Twin Cities, but also because the Minnesota Historical Society runs a truly remarkable restoration and interpretive program at the post. A visit starts at the underground Fort Snelling History Center, serving as the visitor center, museum, and gift shop. The center has an orientation film on the history of the post, along with frequently changing exhibits and a wide variety of public education programs. A visit to Fort Snelling is almost like a walk back through time. From the Modern History Center, you'll pass a number of abandoned World War II-era military buildings before getting to the fort from the 1820s. Once you pass the sentries posted at the gatehouse, you're immediately immersed into the fort's early days. If you're there during the summer, living history surrounds you with not only drills and musket fire, but laundresses and blacksmiths, carpenters and cooks, fur traders and artists. Even Colonel Snelling and his wife are there to tell you about the difficulty and rewards of frontier fort life. Living history programs are also offered on weekends in the spring and fall. 15 structures at Fort Snelling have been rebuilt or restored to their original condition and purpose. The most photographed is the round tower, which in the photograph of the soldiers you can see in the background there. Which from its top also provides the best view of the fort, and that's the view that you see in the lower right corner there. Directly across the grounds from the tower is the commanding officer's house, beautifully detailed and finished, and where you'll find the colonel and his missus. Behind the quarters is the Half Moon Battery, which overlooks the confluence of the Mississippi on the left and the Minnesota to the right, giving a commanding view of all those passing the fort by water. Today's tall trees at the base of the stone bluff block much of the view of the rivers, but provide substantial shade for the biking trails at Fort Snelling State Park below. The third original building from the old fort is the officers' quarters. Virtually all of the other buildings, including the settler's store, stone barracks, and hospital, also have living history interpreters to satisfy your curiosity. Tours are offered, but the fort's tour map will adequately guide you through. Expect to spend a minimum of 2 hours at the fort, although you could easily spend half a day. And I was starting to say, when I began the book, I thought this might only include about 25 to 30 posts. I guess I was kind of going on conventional thinking. People wanted to go where there was staff there to interpret the site for you, that you needed a human being to interact with to gain an appreciation of the post. But the more I studied the forts and the more I visited the sites, I said, no, I really have to include the sites that don't have people at them. The history happened here just as much as it happened to the more tourism-oriented sites. And I said, I'm missing out on a great deal of history if I don't include these posts. And one of these that I did want to make sure I had in the book was Fort Rice, located in south central North Dakota. I'll tell you a little bit about that, and you can see that maybe this may not be some place that people want to visit, but nonetheless, there it is. In July 1864, during his expedition against the Sioux, General Alfred Sully established Fort Rice. It was named for General James Clay Rice, who was killed in the Battle of Spotsylvania. The fort's purpose initially was to supply the expedition, but eventually it was used to control the Sioux and protect emigration from Minnesota to Montana and navigation on the Missouri River. Located on a high point above the Missouri on its west bank, the post originally consisted of rough huts built of cottonwood logs and earth-covered roofs. The fort was too small for the several hundred men stationed there, and living conditions were not healthy. In fact, the fort lost more men in its first year than all of the following years combined. 81 men died in the first 12 months, including 37 of scurvy, 24 of chronic diarrhea, 3 of typhoid, 10 of other diseases, and 7 from Indian attack. More substantial buildings went up in 1868, and a vegetable garden was planted to improve nutrition. Fort Rice was an active post throughout its first 10 years, serving as an operational base for both of Sully's expeditions. Important Indian councils were held at the fort from 1866 to 1868, including a great council with area Sioux that led to the Fort Laramie Treaty, ending Red Cloud's War. In the early 1870s, the fort served as the base for the first 3 Yellowstone expeditions. 4 of Fort Rice's 7th Cavalry companies traveled with Custer in his 1874 Black Hills expedition, and 2 companies fought at the Little Bighorn. When Fort Yates was built downstream in 1874, Fort Rice had lost its significance. It was abandoned in 1878, with a small detachment continuing at the post to dispose of its buildings and other improvements. Today's Fort Rice State Historic Site is somewhat similar to its sister Fort Ransom site in that there's little to see other than the markings of foundations and historical and interpretive markers. It differs from its sister fort site, however, in that it isn't quite as prettified. The terrain is drier here at Fort Rice. The ground is hard with no green grass to cushion your walk. The restrooms at the site no longer function and are locked up, and the picnic area isn't shaded. To top it off, Fort Rice has been taken over by scores of prairie dogs, whose mounds pockmark the grounds as the animals bark at those approaching their post. Employees of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, which owns and manages the site, aren't proud of it and will usually encourage you to visit another state property instead. If you now think that this is the last place you want to go, ignore those feelings. There's something about Fort Rice that makes it easy to spend a lonely hour walking around the grounds. Maybe it's the importance that the fort once held and its tremendous history. Maybe it's seeing such a site just on the edge of disappearing. Or maybe it's the humor of prairie dogs scolding you to get out of their yard. And there's plenty of prairie dogs. And when I started including these posts, the unstaffed posts, I thought this might be where the book would end, and that's what I thought. This is probably about the limit of what I could encourage the reader to come out and see. But I'm really kind of a selfish guy. I wrote the book for me because this is what I'm interested in. I thought, just as easily as I'm interested in this sort of thing, there's probably just as many other people that want to see just the historical markers, and they don't care if it's a historical marker. One thing about my map there, you can see in the Wyoming portion, Fort Reno on about the left center of the map there in Wyoming. Fort Reno is one of the 3 original forts built to protect the Bozeman Trail. And if you go to the site today, you get off the interstate at the town of Casey, Wyoming, and you get on a highway that initially has asphalt shoulders along the highway. Not too long after you leave the town, the shoulders disappear and goes to a gravel siding, and then pretty soon the gravel disappears, and so you're just on a narrow 2-lane highway. And about a half hour out of town, you'll get to a bend in the road, but before that bend is a very small sign indicating Bozeman Trail, and that's the trail that you want to take. You may regret it once you get on it, because it turns into a rock road that kicks up dust like you wouldn't believe it. Your car will be white by the time you're done with this trip. It's a washboard road, so if your shocks aren't good on your car, or if they are good, they'll be much worse by the time you get off of this. And you're driving up the Bozeman Trail, and you go up for about 10 miles, and you'll see occasional all-weather historic markers, interpretive signs along the way. But then about the 9-mile mark, you'll get to a pull-off area. You get out of your car there, and out in the middle of the field, about a fifth of a mile into the field, is the site of Fort Reno. There's a granite marker at the site erected by the state of Wyoming and the DAR in 1914. And you are at the site of Fort Reno. This is the southern end of the forts protecting the Bozeman Trail. And you might think, I came all this way just to see this, but you get out there and you're in the Bozeman River Valley, and you see just the scarcity of trees out there. And this is very dry, there's nothing green there. And you see the foothills of the Rocky in the background and the Sawtooth, and you look around, there's no houses, the power lines are virtually non-existent, and you're seeing nobody else coming up the road. I mean, you've just gone on the Bozeman Trail, and the traffic's probably a lot lighter today than it was 140 years ago. And you really gain an appreciation for what life was like for the soldiers, somewhat there. And in terms of that, you definitely can experience the loneliness there, the boredom of the soldiers out there. And if you can imagine Indians just being over that little rise to the north there, you can imagine the fear that they had. Great numbers of soldiers went AWOL from these posts. They saw no future for them there. A lot of them felt it wasn't deserved for them to be at these posts. So a good number of them headed west for the gold mines, or headed north for the hunting, or headed south to join up with the railroad rather than stick around at these posts. So I think these places are too great to ignore them and to not include them. And there's a number of forts like that along the trail there. Fort Ripley, which is up in Minnesota, is on a National Guard camp actually, and to get to the site, which buildings are all gone, there's only a pile of stone there that indicates where the powder magazine was. But if you're desperate to see it, you can contact the National Guard, make arrangements, and bring 10 of your best friends to come along with you, because they won't accommodate anybody less than 10 in their group. There's Fort Halleck in Wyoming, which is on a private ranch. I did get to see it before it was sold, and so there's a photograph of that site in the book. But there's Fort Yates on the south end of North Dakota, which the National Park Service had said there were no buildings remaining. But after 2 trips there and close inspection, I finally did find a building there. Actually, may have housed it was a former jail, and may have housed Sitting Bull, according to tribal legend there, and will be turned into a museum by the Standing Rock tribe. But the last fort I'm going to talk about is a fort which I was very fortunate to see at the time, but is now unfortunately gone again. It comes and goes, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And that's Fort Sully, New Fort Sully, the second Fort Sully in South Dakota. Colonel Dallas B. Sackett came to Fort Sully, the first Fort Sully, in 1866, and while inspecting the Missouri River forts, found the post in such a bad location that it outlived its use and exhausted its resources. Its soldiers were encamped, living on dirt floors and surrounded by a cottonwood stockade that was starting to rot away. Before continuing his journey, Sackett ordered that the post be abandoned and a new site built upriver. New Fort Sully was established on July 26, 1866, on a bend of the Missouri about 30 miles north of the old fort. The site was finely situated for steamboat landings, with good view both downstream and up, and amply supplied with timber and grass. More than 800 logs were collected for the new sawmill, and work on the fort began in earnest. By the next year, the men had erected a number of wood frame officers' quarters and enlisted men's barracks of cottonwood logs. In the years to come, the post expanded substantially, and many called it the most attractive of the Missouri River forts. Although the neighboring Sioux were less than pleased with another post on the Missouri, Fort Sully saw few hostilities. Its role was primarily to protect and provide for the adjacent Sioux reservation, and by the early 1870s, it was serving as a supply fort for the post more actively involved in the Indian Wars. The westward rails bypassed the fort, leaving riverboats its primary source of transportation and emphasizing its isolation. No longer needed by 1894, Fort Sully was abandoned on October 20th of that year. Buildings were sold off or otherwise disposed of, but local citizens continued to visit the fort and even placed an historical marker at the site in 1929. In 1948, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of the Oahe Dam, a project that ultimately took Fort Sully off the map. The waters of Lake Oahe inundated the site, but not before citizens rescued the marker and moved it to the front yard of the Sully County Courthouse in Oneida in 1862. For today, depending upon the amount of rainfall, the remains of New Fort Sully are either there or not. The site is underwater when Lake Oahe is full, and exposed but barren when the reservoir level is down during drought conditions. The base of the historical marker is the only man-made object that is clearly discernible. Virtually everything else is gone and covered by weeds, brush, and soil, although foundation work and depressions indicate structures that once stood there. I'll tell you a little bit, read a little bit from the Visiting New Fort Sully chapter, because this is kind of this kind of tells you what you're up against if you do want to see it. Located in Sully County in central South Dakota, New Fort Sully deserves a second thought and a third and a fourth before you attempt to visit it. Getting there is extremely difficult. After driving about a half hour north of Pierre, you must travel over miles of gravel, dirt, and high-centered range roads, and then hike a couple miles through rugged terrain of yucca, cacti, chest-high weeds, and possibly rattlesnakes in the warmer months. There are no signs or paths telling you whether you're headed in the right direction, and if you do find the site, it's likely that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officials patrolling the lake will detain you and issue a fine. For that reason, this guide will not tell you how to get there, and this is the only one I don't tell you how to get there to, because I don't want to be named as a co-defendant in any lawsuits that are up from that. A large portion of the site is open for game hunting, and because New Fort Sully has been the victim of looters over the years, another portion is signed for no trespassing. The Corps strongly enforces the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which provides for penalties of up to $250,000 and 5 years in jail. And that is scarier than rattlesnakes. Your best bet is to simply visit the original marker in Oneida at the courthouse, about 32 miles north of Pierre on US 83. Admission to New Fort Sully is free unless the Corps of Engineers catches you there. So I do warn you about that one. And I did check, they had a boat sports and travel show in Omaha earlier this year. And I know there was a few of the marinas on Lake Oahe there. And I asked them, I showed them the book, I said, what's the status of that now? And they said, it's about 14 feet underwater now. So the drought is over for the most part. And the top photo and the photo to the left you won't see those views until the next drought, whenever that takes place. So really the only way you can see anything of Fort Sully is to drive about 15 miles to the east and get to the courthouse. And that's how you do see it there. And I tell you, this is a lot of the book was just plain dumb luck in getting to some of these sites. To find Fort Sully, I had assumed it was underwater and didn't go there. There's about a half dozen forts that are under the Missouri River now because of the damming of the river. But Buddy and I were headed up to Pierre to check out a few other sites. We had stopped at an antique store along I-90 and just looking for old books and that sort of thing, and just happened to overhear somebody telling the shopkeeper that a friend of his had found a Fort Thompson token at the Fort Sully site. And so I'm hearing Fort, and I said, I couldn't help but overhear it. You're talking about the old Fort Sully site, which has public access and it's at a recreation area. And he said, no, the new Fort Sully site. I said, but that's underwater. And he said, not now, it isn't. So we immediately changed our plans and spent the rest of the day trying to find Fort Sully on our own. We couldn't. Toward the end of the day, we asked a local rancher who did tell us how to get there. We came back the next day. It was about a 2-hour ordeal getting to the site, and found the site. We were convinced of it. We didn't know what that concrete base was until we got back to town and stopped at the state archives, and they let us know that was the base of the historic marker that used to be there. They also let us know that that trespassing was expressly forbidden there, and it was clearly marked, and we did not see a sign. And the only explanation that we had was that we must have come from a direction that they didn't think anybody would ever try, because I mean, as hard as it was to get there and to run back, we were late checking out for the hotel and everything. We had to beg to let them get our stuff and take a quick shower because we were a mess after hiking out there. But the Corps of Engineers was somewhat cooperative with me and telling me about it. And one thing they did say, please encourage people or discourage people in your book not to visit the site. So, but I felt because the book, what I was essentially doing with this was taking a snapshot of the forts at this point in time. A friend of mine, Herb Hart, wrote a great series of fort books back in the early 60s and 70s. And the status of some of the forts that he visited are completely different now than what they were then. And I felt that this book should be, at this point in time, need to know what was the condition of these posts. Some of them have become state parks since Herb visited them. Some of them have deteriorated even more. Some are no longer active military posts. And that kind of gets to the question, why do the forts matter? Why is it important that we do know about them? And to some people, I guess the forts don't matter. I mentioned that half a dozen forts are now under the Missouri River. No hope of visiting those again. Local citizens didn't put up historic markers, so there apparently wasn't much interest in that. Some people say the forts represent oppression of the indigenous tribes of the Great Plains. For nearly 40 years, they were engaged in warfare against them, and certainly changed their way of life. But being a Nebraskan, living in Nebraska, I think the forts are very, very important to our heritage. This is a map I made. This is a map from 1879, but I inserted the location of the forts of the state, as well as some of the battles between federal troops and Indians here. The book highlights 12 sites in Nebraska, but there are actually close to 50 different federal military posts in the state. A good number of them, especially along the Platte River there, you can see out west, located about every 10 miles. Most of these were Pony Express stations that were taken over by the Army during the summers of 1864 and 65. Nebraska, western Nebraska, was a very, very dangerous place to be at that point. Troops were needed to escort the shipping wagons, the wagon trains coming through the state, and escorted them from one post to the other, every 10 miles or so. But the forts had much greater roles as well. I mean, you look at Fort Kearny in the central part of the state. Fort Kearny protected the trails coming through here: the Oregon Trail, Mormon Trail, California Trail, Overland Trail. And you think of the hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of Americans and immigrants that came through this area. This was the largest peacetime migration of people in the world's history. When people are moving in those numbers, it's usually because of war or pestilence or some other thing that's driving them out from where they were. But these are actually people coming through here, through our state, to find a better way of life. Life wasn't bad where they came from, but they thought they could do much better. And it inspired, like I said, tens of thousands of people to come through here. And Fort Kearny had a role in protecting that and providing repairs and information as was needed in crossing the plains. You had personalities like Custer, Cody, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, John J. Pershing, Walter Reed coming through the forts of Nebraska. And they came here because of the forts. The forts are what brought them here. Coming to a close here, I do want to emphasize that one thing I hope you do come away with is a greater appreciation for the forts and a greater appreciation for what we do have today. Two forts that I've become more involved with in the past year. One of them is Fort Atkinson. Of course, the two forts I'm going to talk about are both state historical parks. And these are sites that, of course, they're in the state park system, but they really haven't received the attention that I feel that is due them. The emphasis more and more has been on the recreation areas, on the dam sites, and selling and hunting and fishing passes. And these are sites that haven't been getting substantial budgets, even when times were good. Fort Atkinson is just a fantastic site. This represents not only the very first fort in Nebraska, but the very first fort on the Great Plains. This happened here. Personalities like Jim Bridger, Jim Beckworth came through here, Stephen Kearny. Albert Sidney Johnston was the general in the Civil War. They got their training here. Fort Atkinson, of interest to where we are today, Fort Atkinson was the location of the first library in Nebraska. And as this was the first fort, and this is the kind of the outpost of America at the time, I haven't heard anybody say otherwise, but it's probably the first library on the Great Plains took place at Fort Atkinson. Another post I've become very involved in is Fort Hartsuff. I can't tell you how many presentations I've given, which include Fort Hartsuff, and people come up to me and say, I've never heard of that and never been there. Part of that is marketing. I have heard that for a number of years now, Fort Hartsuff has only received about $100 a year for advertising. And there's not a great deal of people you can tell about yourself for $100 a year. But it's just a fantastic fort. I mean, it's one of those posts built not only for the protection of the citizens, of the white citizens of the state, but it was actually built as a buffer between the Sioux and their enemies, the Pawnee, which had the reservation to the east. So it was built for that reason. Fort Hartsuff is also very, very unique. Well, can't emphasize unique more than unique, but it's the only fort that I know of built of concrete, because Fort Hartsuff was located in the North Loup Valley, where there's plenty of lime and gravel and water there. The buildings were constructed of concrete, which helped it stand today. It's been reconstructed, of course, or rehabilitated, restored, but this is probably the best preserved fort on the Great Plains. It's essentially all of the buildings are still there. The water tower is the only thing I know of that's missing, and just beautiful buildings. It's a perfect example of the small prairie forts of that time. Never had more than 55 soldiers there, and if you go there today, it's essentially what you would have seen back in the 1870s. It's just a wonderful little site. But these are two sites that, because they don't get the attention, because they're not sexy, somewhat. They don't have the wave pools and the conference centers and water slides that you can find at some other state parks up the interstate here. And they're somewhat neglected, and of course they've been paying for that. Without marketing, you don't have people visiting the forts, and if people aren't visiting the forts, then the Game and Parks Commission sees that as not performing their role in attracting people to them. So it's kind of a vicious circle, but that's what's happening. So I do want to encourage you, please visit the forts in Nebraska, particularly our state historic park forts. They're just wonderful little sites, and without attention, they are going to eventually be mothballed and closed up. That's my greatest fear right now, particularly in times that we're in now. But anyway, I appreciate very much your coming out today. As a Nebraskan, I'm very proud of the history and the heritage that we have in our state, and as fellow Nebraskans, I hope you are too. Thank you very much.